Welcome to Redirect, Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins. This week, flying solo. Matthew, our beloved co-host, is out doing, actual lawyer work. This week, a couple things that I just wanted to touch on real quick that I think are important. And I know we've kind of hashed over some of this before, but I think it's a good reminder for people because I saw the other day CIS, the Center for Immigration Studies. They published a little infographic video thing about chain migration. Now, if you remember, it's been now, maybe a year or 2 years since we had a real influx of scary chain migration talk from the president and from the people in the White House. And chain migration is not a legal term. It's a substitute term that sounds more racist-y that a lot of these hate groups and anti-immigrant groups came up with because family immigration, which is what it's, actually called, sounds too family-y. So they, prefer chain migration, as you could imagine. So there's this idea. It's sort of a cousin of the anchor baby idea, which is that if you let one immigrant over, they will end up bringing their entire family, right? Their entire very scary, very immigrant, very different family. And the bottom line is that's not really true. And it's kind of rendered impossible by our very complicated immigration laws. So I want to clear one thing up. We say all the time that there's no such thing as the line. People say, you should get in line like my ancestors did. And if people would just get in line and wait their turn, they could do it because I know somebody from high school on Facebook and his wife got papers. And so you can too, right? Okay. There's no such thing. And our retort is always that there's no such thing as a line, which is true. There's no generic line. You can't just go and apply for papers because you want to live here. There's all kinds of different visas, some temporary, some permanent, with all kinds of requirements and disqualifiers, and it's a real mess. But there is no just sort of go get in line. So that's the first thing. But in the family context, sometimes there, in fact, is a line. And the way that happens is that the family immigration system is broken up into immediate family members for whom there is no line. There's visas available right away. There's no limitation on the number of visas that the State Department or the Department of Homeland Security can grant for these folks, immediate family members. And that includes minor children of U.S. citizens, parents of U.S. citizens, and also spouses of U.S. citizens. So for these folks, if you're a U.S. citizen and you marry a foreign national, they should have a visa available to them right away. Now, that doesn't mean they get a visa. There are thousands, I don't know how many, at least tens of thousands, I would say, of U.S. citizens married to foreign nationals who, despite the marriage, don't qualify for an immigrant visa, maybe because they've entered the country more than one time illegally, or they have some sort of infectious disease, or they have committed a crime that renders them ineligible. Anyways, there's a bunch of things, right? There's a bunch of things. But in general, for those people, there's no visa quota. Now, for other types of family groups, there are what's called preference categories. And there's a certain number of visas available per year for all the world for each of these different categories. And they're divided up into different groups, different countries. And so now some people still think that you could, for example, petition for your nephew or your cousin, and you can't. The preference categories are divided as such. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can petition for your adult children, your children over 21 years old, married or unmarried. If you're a lawful permanent resident, so a green card holder, you can petition for your spouse or your unmarried children. That's it. If you are a U.S. citizen, you can also petition for a sibling. Okay, so that's the world of visas that are available. There's no grandmother visa, for example. There's no cousin visa, nephew visa, best friend visa. I remember we talked to an immigration consultant in New Zealand. We did a series. It was supposed to be, I think, tongue-in-cheek at the time, like, where will we go if Trump wins? Ha, ha, ha. So we were going to interview people who do immigration in other countries to find out how hard it is to get papers in their countries. And this guy from New Zealand said, basically, like, if you have a girlfriend from New Zealand, you can get a work permit. So that is not the case here. So going back to how these visas are allocated, if you're curious, you can Google Visa Bulletin. And it's usually the top hit. It's the State Department website. Every month, they publish a visa bulletin, which explains these different categories and how many visas are available for each category. So just as an example, F4, that's the category, brothers and sisters of adult U.S. citizens. There's 65,000 visas available per year. So if you scroll down, there's a little chart. It's very convenient. There's basically 5 different groups. There's Philippines, Mexico, India, China, and then everywhere else. What happens is 65,000 visas available. But every year, let's say I'm making up these numbers, but not that number. But let's say there's 85,000 applicants. Well, that means that you've got 20,000 extra people. There's no visa available to them. So they've got to wait till the next year when additional visas are freed up. Well, if the next year there's 90,000, plus the 20,000 from before, you can see what starts to happen. A line starts to form. And it becomes very, very long. So most of my clients are Mexican. And for the F4, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens category, right now, they are processing applications that were filed in January of 1998. Now, that's 22 years on the calendar. But if you look at how the line actually moves in a calendar year, that date only goes up maybe 10 months. Some years it's 8 months or 6 months. So it's actually not 22 years. It's more like 30 or 40 years. So if I'm a U.S. citizen and I petition for my sister who's living in Mexico in January of 1998, she is just now eligible to apply for her visa. And for many of those people, I mean, maybe she's totally disqualified. Maybe she's been here illegally before or, some other thing, and she's not going to be eligible. But that's sort of how these preference categories work. Now, some of these other groups, they're not quite as backlogged. So for the all other countries, the current date is July of 2006. So, that's only 14 years. For China, 2006, India, 2004. And for the Philippines, it's July of 1999. So these things are extraordinarily backlogged. And you can take a look at the other preference categories. But let's just give some examples of how we would get a family member over, a certain family member. So let's say I'm from Mexico and I want to bring over my grandmother. Well, first I need to get papers. So let's say I marry a U.S. citizen, right? And she petitions for me. And we're going to just skip right over this big, messy analysis of whether or not I'm going to qualify for a green card. And let's just say I do qualify for a green card and I get it. First of all, I get what's called a 2-year conditional green card, which means after an additional 2 years, I have to file another application to prove that I'm either divorced, but the marriage was legitimate, or that I'm still married to my U.S. citizen spouse. So let's say I do that. Now, if I got my green card through a U.S. citizen spouse, I can apply for my citizenship after 3 years, so long as I'm still not just married to the U.S. citizen, but living together. Now, if we're separated or we're divorced, then I've got to wait the full 5 years until I can apply for citizenship. Now, on top of that, I've got to qualify for U.S. citizenship, which means being proficient in English, reading and writing, and passing a civics test. It's not that hard, but I do need to learn English if I haven't learned it already. And obviously there's some other bars if I maybe owe child support or haven't paid my taxes or I've committed certain crimes or I'm not deemed to be a person of good moral character or whatever. So there's lots of ways for me to maybe not hit that mark. But from the day I became a permanent resident to the day I can actually apply for my parents, it's going to be at least 5 years, right? Plus any processing time. So probably closer to 7 years if we add in all the paperwork and whatnot. So at that point, I'm a U.S. citizen. I was born in Mexico, but I did it the right way and I got my green card and I applied for citizenship. I took an oath of fealty. I promised I would bear arms on behalf of this country if the law requires it, of course. So now I can apply for my parents. My parents have to qualify for a visa. From Mexico, the situation that comes up all the time is that maybe my parents entered the country illegally and spent here, maybe more than a year before going back. They might not be eligible for a green card. They might face certain bars or penalties. But let's just assume that my parents live in Mexico and they've never done anything to bar themselves from being admitted into the United States. And so I can file the paperwork if I don't hire a lawyer, and I think I'm a smart person. And shout out to people who file their own paperwork. Not recommended. I've seen some real disasters this week. And I just got to say, I know this is going to sound totally self-serving, but some real heartache this week that could have been avoided if people had hired a lawyer. But let's say I decide I don't need a lawyer and I file for my parents who live in Mexico and are totally eligible for a visa. Processing right now, you're looking at probably 2 years. I've had these types of cases go through in less than a year, but it's been a while since that happened. So probably about 2 years. So from the day I got my green card until I can bring my parents over, we're now, I think, at about 9 years until they come to the United States with their green cards. Now they're permanent residents, right? And the whole thing kind of starts over. So if they want to naturalize so they can petition for their parents, they've got to be permanent residents for at least 5 years, learn English, which is a barrier for a lot of older folks, right? At this point, maybe my parents are a little bit older, and it's harder to learn a new language when you're older. So I think we said 9 years for them to get a green card. Now we're at 14 years, 9 plus 5. They worked really hard on their English. Now they're eligible to apply for citizenship, and they do 14 years. Now let's say 15 for them to actually get their certificate of citizenship. Now they can apply for their parents after, I think, 15 years and then maybe a couple more years of processing. So if somebody comes to me and they're like, I just got my green card, my real goal here is to get grandma and grandpa over because they kind of raised me. I'm really close to them. And I just think it would be great if they could come and live in this country. Okay, that's great. But you're looking at least, I would say, 15 years to get grandma and grandpa over. And what about like an uncle? Like I really love my uncle. Well, okay, we got to get the parent over first because I can't just petition for my uncle. So I think we established that for the parent, 15 years for them to apply for their citizenship. And then my dad applies for his brother, which would be my uncle. But from Mexico, that petition to get my uncle over is going to take at least 30 years, maybe even longer. So if somebody comes to me and they say, I just got my green card, I'm from Mexico, and my real goal is to get my uncle here, the answer is basically like, that's nice, I'll be dead. Like by the time that happens, like I don't know how old your uncle is, but if he's older than 40, then forget about it, right? He's probably going to be dead too. And so you can start to see how this idea that I married a U.S. citizen and I got my green card, and now it's just going to be this flood of people is absurd. It just doesn't work that way. I'm sorry my numbers got a little bit frazzled, but the point remains, just to get my parents over here, it's going to take a long time. For them to get their parents over here, it's going to take a long time. For them to get an uncle or anybody else, like their adult children, It's going to take a really, 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 really long time. And this can create some absurd situations where, for example, let's say I become a US citizen and I want to bring over my mom and also my younger brother, who's, let's say, 8. Okay. So my mom is in Mexico living with my 8-year-old brother. Well, I'm a US citizen. And like I mentioned earlier, my mom is an immediate relative. So she can come over right away, with the processing times, of course. So it's going to be a couple of years, but she can come. There's no quota. But my younger brother, he's going to be subject to the preference category. So if I apply for him, it's going to be like 30 years. So in most cases, the best thing to do is to petition for my mom, get her green card, and then she can petition for her son, her other son, who's a minor child. And that's a preference category also, but it's not as backlogged. Usually it's just, maybe a year or two. Right now it's current, so it's up to date. But that's how I would have to get my minor brother over. So even something simple like my mother and my younger sibling, it's this whole convoluted trap. It doesn't make any sense. So anyways, I hope people sort of understand that. And then also to understand that it's not like you go onto government.com and click on brother and then like a visa comes up or wife or whatever. Each one of these family members has to qualify on their own. They have to be eligible for a visa. Many people who have petitions, even approved petitions, don't qualify for the visa when the visa becomes available. They're disqualified for one of many reasons. And on top of that, you have to pay filing fees and be subjected to background checks and interviews and all of these things. And so even assuming in a case, where I've got lots of family and I file everything correctly and we wait the right amount of time and we're very patient and everyone's just sort of waiting in line, it could be that in the end, like almost none of my family qualifies. So anyways, I just wanted to clear that up because I know on the one hand, we say there is no line because that's true. But then when we get into the family context, we do have to sort of explain that, in fact, there's lines and they're highly restrictive. One of the things we see with immigration reform, when they talk about immigration reform, is rather than fix some of these backlogs, a lot of groups are advocating, for example, for eliminating the F4 visa category, which is siblings of U.S. citizens. Like, let's just get rid of it. You shouldn't be able to bring your brother or your sister here. Like, give me a break. But, you can imagine, I don't know if you have siblings, like maybe some of them you hate and you'd be fine with that. But there are other people who maybe weren't really raised by their parents and their older sister was kind of the mom. And it would actually, in the context of that family, make more sense for that person to be able to bring their sister over than their mom, who, maybe barely even had contact with them growing up or, wasn't all that involved in their life. And so that's one of the problems with these categories is they ignore the sort of nuance of what family is and what it can mean. But, the main thing is that I think we're going to see more and more of these attacks. The president's starting to ramp up his rallies as he's known to do. And I've noticed he's been talking a lot more about, well, I don't know if it's more, but they're definitely leaning on the immigration thing and talking about immigrants and MS-13 as if they were synonyms. And if you listen to him talking, he sort of floats in between the two as if there were no distinction. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to hear chain migration come back to life and to hear people express this kind of concern. And hopefully this sort of little mini-sode will be something that you can share with them so they can see, like, actually, to get your Mexican uncle over here, it's like 1,000 years. It's basically impossible. And it's not just Mexico. It's all other countries are facing these, similar backlogs, although not quite as severe as Mexico, but still pretty bad. Anyhow, so thanks for listening, I guess. We really appreciate all the positive feedback we get on the show. You can become a patron at patreon.com/redirect, and that's a way to throw a couple dollars our way. We're trying to get to 140, and we're just sort of like floating right around 135. We agreed to take another pro bono case if we hit 140. And so if you're so inclined, hop over there, become a patron, and we'll take another pro bono case. What else can you do? Subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, all those places. And if you do that, we really appreciate it. Yeah, we'll talk to you guys next week.